Other questions?
Well, I have a question actually from the actor's point of view.
Sure.
From what you noticed, whose performance on stage you feel was the most realistic to their character?
Oh, wow! Do you mean... Like, okay, can we take the actors out of it and say, like, which character?
Yeah, which character was most realistic to, like, the actual person in their life?
I think a lot of them are as close as what we could get. I mean, one of the things that I wrote down is that certainly from the folio, what we understand, and from his will, because he did in fact leave 3 of his friends enough money to buy these mourning rings that they are wearing. He was very close to these friends that he had. The men he did theater with were you know, a sort of very tight-knit group, and they all really loved each other. So I think the leaving of the rings is a good thing, and I think that throughout the play, the way that they show that it was really their desire to see his work preserved for the love of him, and not really for any, I mean, there was no monetary gain, but not for monetary gain that they went ahead with the printing of his plays. It really was because they all loved each other. So I think that they did an awesome job with, you know, Burbage and Hemmings, and just like showing those characters and kind of the simple relationship that they had that we can all relate to, like having friends who we really love and really admire and think are stellar at whatever they're doing. So yeah, I thought there were a lot of people. There were a lot of people who I'm like, I wrote down something else about, I was wondering if Hemmings' relationship with his wife, we have all of these letters between one of Shakespeare's actors and his wife, and that was also a really sweet relationship. He's always writing her, asking how the garden's doing. He calls her his little mouse all throughout. It's like very sweet. So even when they were traveling out of Stratford-upon-Avon, you can see that love between the actor and his wife, and I think that probably this playwright modeled that in some of the husband-wife relationships that we see in this play, where they are truly affectionate. Also, certainly, just like to be a real downer, the insane amount of child loss. And then we see those in the letters and what they go through. And the playwright never brings it up, but that was a huge part of Shakespeare's story. His own son died when he was just 11 years old. And his name was Hamnet, so you can kind of glean from that what you will, but that was a huge part of their lives also. So just seeing that kind of like death and loss represented on stage, I thought was really, really nice and very true to what Shakespeare's life was like. Yeah, motion?
Did Burbage's death really spark the collection of all of the gathering of the plays?
I have no idea.
Okay.
What I can tell you is that Burbage's copies do exist. And what scholars love about Burbage's copies of especially like the role of Hamlet, we have his Hamlet, we have his Othello, for sure. And I think there was one other mentioned that maybe we do have a copy of. But what they love is that they're scribbled all over. So what it makes clear is that Shakespeare was in the room with all the actors. He was usually acting in the shows. They didn't have directors. They didn't have stage managers. They didn't have someone off stage. They had a prompter in case they forgot their lines. But that wasn't a director, and that was the only person. So they were working the scripts together, and there's even one Burbage script where he's just like hacked apart a bunch of Othello and just is like written next to it essentially like, this is garbage. and sure enough, it doesn't show up in the folio. So he was listening, and this is probably why he's so brilliant. He was listening to his actors. Not all playwrights were in the room with their actors, but we know Shakespeare was. He owned shares in his company, he acted in his company, and he listened to his actors. And yeah, Burbages are just like, they'll have entrance and exit notes, and they'll have fighting notes, and they'll have big parts crossed out, or words changed, or additions made. So, so Burbage's, I think, depiction is very real in that he was the holder of so much of what Shakespeare had written and was an active part of writing it. So, his kind of like pride, and that's not what it said, and that's not like, I think that was really realistic. But whether or not his death spurned it, I don't know. Okay. His His death happened in there.
One more question. Was Henry really that big a fan of Pericles?
I have no idea, but I like Pericles. We just had this conversation on the way in. It is one of the more questionable as far as, like, we know Shakespeare wrote some of his plays in their entirety, especially the ones we love the most, actually. Much Ado About Nothing, As You Like It, Hamlet, King Lear. I try to tell people you have to kind of think of it just as like any other Elizabethan job. Playwrights were apprenticing in the beginning, then they were masters working on their own, and then they were training someone up at the end. So at the end, Shakespeare was training up another author, a couple others, but Fletcher among them, who's mentioned in this play. At the beginning, he's writing with Marlowe quite a bit. So, so Pericles is towards the end, so it's very possible that Fletcher had a huge hand in Pericles. It's really hard to tell. You know, there are people now who do like analysis, like Shakespeare used these words and Fletcher used these words, and so who wrote which part, and they never would have seen it that way. They did literally sometimes go home, and you can see there are way more plot holes in his early plays and his late plays, because they kind of like, okay, you write Act 1, I'll write Act 2, you write Act 3, see you tomorrow. And then you would come in and you'd be like, well, wait, she just had a baby, but she was never pregnant. Like, nobody cares. Nobody cares. And that happens in Act 3. So they didn't really have ownership over them in the same way, but they did write them like in pieces. If that makes sense. Yeah.
What other plays, if any, do folks think maybe should be in the canon but aren't?
There's one, I can't even think of the name of it. There's one about Don Quixote. Cardenio. Cardenio is often debated if Cardenio should be, it's not about Don Quixote, it's based on Don Quixote, if that one should be in there or not. And then the Edward, the second, third, one of the Edward. There's an Edward that it's questionable if he wrote, or wrote with Marlowe wrote an Edward, and it's questionable, did Shakespeare write that Edward with Marlowe and then write the one that came after, or did he not write it at all? So there's just a few. And then they mentioned some of the ones that we've just never found. I loved the joke about Love's Labour's One, because Love's Labour's One is lost, but Love's Labour's Lost is found. And we might find it one day. You were asking about the copies in the folio. They're constantly, like, every decade, they'll be like, oh, in someone's grandpa's attic, some weird estate in England, there was this folio squirreled away, and then we'll have a new copy. So there's always that hope that one day we might find Love's Labour's Lost. But we have a pretty good catalog. That was one of the things I wrote in here, is I loved Hemming's character as like the manager. We know most of what we know about how Elizabethan Shakespeare ran, how Elizabethan plays were run from managerial diaries, which are insanely detailed. This was a business. I love the joke about, like, there's no non-profit business, because now all theaters are non-profit, but in Shakespeare's day, they were definitely for profit. And they kept really meticulous details that we know a lot from.
Did Shakespeare have as much movies?
No, it's really kind of a funny thing. I think that the Shakespeare Johnson thing is pretty accurate. There was a playwright named Greene. He was the one who famously called Shakespeare an upstart crow glorified with our feathers. He was just basically sort of elitist. Shakespeare hadn't gone to college, and so Greene was like, wow, this guy who didn't go to college, now everybody loves his plays. He really hated Shakespeare. And Johnson was kind of in that running group with Greene. And so that's where we get this idea of like this rivalry, but also a deep respect. I think Johnson's, sort of preface to the folio is really heartfelt and genuine. He knew Shakespeare was a genius, but no, he really didn't have any enemies, and a lot of the sensationalism of his life is, people want him to have been an exciting guy. he wasn't that exciting. he was lovely. I think he seems like a lovely guy. He loved his family. He loved his friends on the stage. When his brother died, his brother was an actor. When his brother died, he paid to have the bells of the cathedral in London ring for 2 days. He left everything in his will to his family. Anne was a really unlikely choice for a wife, but he seems to have very genuinely loved her, very genuinely loved his daughters. He was raised by a woman who could read and write, which was very unheard of, and I never leave a discussion about Shakespeare without saying that, because I think his mother had so much to do with who Shakespeare is, because he had a parent at home. His dad was kind of a fop. He was not amazing. There's a lot of people who hated him. He was kind of like a dirty small town politician, but his mother was very educated. She was actually the executor of her father's estate. Even though her father had sons, he overlooked his sons and made his daughter his executor. She must have been intelligent, not only literate, but good at math. So I always point that out to people. I'm like, his mom was at home, which means she was probably reading to him, which was a huge difference between Shakespeare and most children growing up in Elizabethan England. To have a mother who could read and write was really extraordinary. That wasn't part of your question, but I had to sneak it in, because I always sneak it in. Yeah.
Well,
Anything else?
I have another question. Did Crane really save the day?
One of my ears, actually.
No idea.
Okay.
So it's a yes.
Probably in the way that they are really pretty good about describing what prompters did. There's one tiny inaccuracy, like they say something about they did the scripts in parts so that people couldn't steal the full script. That's not totally accurate. They did the script in parts because there really was one guy writing them out. He's not going to write 12 copies of the play. He's going to write one big copy and then everyone's parts and then hand them to the people. Or the copies were probably the playwright put those together and the prompter kept notes and stuff. But if you can imagine, you're just saving yourself a lot of work by being like, I'm only writing Lear and Cordelia and, separately. But yeah, I mean, that certainly would have been where all the parts came from. Crane would have written them. So, yeah, important guy.
Yeah, I'll take it.
So it wasn't Ed's fault after all.
Yeah.
So, I'm going back to Shakespeare's mother.
Yeah.
What was her background? Why was she so educated?
No idea. Her father seemed to have really loved her, and it was probably just his decision.
Did she come from aristocracy or?
No, pretty middle-class family. Yeah, upper middle class, Stratford-upon-Avon family, but not like so wealthy it would be notable. But I think it was just, at that time, women were really at the mercy of their fathers to decide whether or not they would get an education. And her father must have really taken to her from a young age and was like, that's the one. Trust her, I believe in her, and I'm going to let her read, write, because they didn't go to school. Only the boys went to school.
Now, for the, I'm sorry, did you have your, over here? No, okay. Like, after the first folio was published, what's the sort of timeline on where now everyone thinks Shakespeare is, the best of all? Obviously he was famous in his time.
Yeah.
But when did he sort of become immortalized in the sort of annals of history, like Shakespeare is, like no one else?
So all the theaters, pretty shortly after this folio was published, there was a big governmental overturn, a big Protestant uprising. All of the theaters shuttered. And then there was a long time in Elizabethan England where, because of that sort of like Protestant sentiment about theater being evil and encouraging all kinds of ill behaviors, nothing was being written. When the theaters reopened in the early 1700s is kind of when everyone was like, damn, that guy was good. and they started doing a lot of his plays again. But even during his time, he was very popular. There's also one mistake in the play. Titus Andronicus was actually his most popular and well-attended play. I think there's a joke in the play where they're like, everyone loves Titus Andronicus, but they're like, but Merry Wives sold better. It actually didn't. Titus Andronicus was his best-selling play in his lifetime, and is not his best-selling play now. But people loved it. They were like, I don't know, hands getting chopped off and people eating their own children, and they were like, let's do it. That was great. Yeah.
I wonder if you could comment on the depiction of Jagger. Do we know enough about him?
No.
Whether this is accurate?
No.
No.
Yeah, I don't know any. Did he print those folios? Yes. Those quartos? Yes. Was he probably a little devious in the way that he did it? Yes. But then did he also come in at the end, and yeah, with his son, and print the complete works accurately? Yes. So I don't know. That's probably a pretty. If I was gonna guess what he was like, I would go close to that.
Okay.
I'd be like, he was probably just trying to make a buck. Yeah, and did make a buck.
Well, one interesting thing about his history, he was the official printer for the city of London from 1611.
Okay.
So I think until he died, which was in 1623.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that obviously shows you that he was an ambitious man and good at what he was doing. Honest, but I was going to talk about that too, because there wasn't they kind of talk about rights in this play. I don't even know that they would have thought of it so much like rights, but that is a good way to phrase it. But there was obviously no intellectual property, so I love the fact that they covered that, like, whoever had it owned it. And Shakespeare stole other people's intellectual property all the time. And someone else named Kidd, last name Kidd. What's Kidd's first name? It's always Matthew or Thomas or something. Kidd, can't remember his first name. He wrote Hamlet first. Shakespeare saw it and then rewrote Hamlet. Much better. It's much better than Kidd's Hamlet, but he wrote it first. Shakespeare stole all his stuff.
I'd like to hear from the cast. What did you learn? What were you challenged by in preparing for the play?
Well, for me, the biggest challenge was trying to learn the English accent, which was a lot of fun. And I really appreciate yours and Stan's efforts at getting us, giving us what we needed to work on to learn it. I had a lot of fun.
I think it was really interesting learning about all the characters. Like, we did a lot of research about each of them and finding out who was actual people and who wasn't. For instance, for my character, for Alice, she's not, at least my understanding, she's not really a real person. I think they did have a child named Alice, but she was not who I am portrayed in this play. But people such as Henry and John and Burbage were all actual people. So.
Yeah, no, coming up that, I really sort of was challenged with, taking these people from this era, this bygone era, and one was, contextualized in a modern way in this play by playwright, but also just how am I going to bring my own attitudes and personality and individuality to this from the 21st century, trying to predict as accurately as possible, and also being entertaining. So it was sort of a juggling act in some ways, but I think everyone did a wonderful job.
Sorry, to comment on sort of, both of those things. I thought you all did a lovely job with the accents. They were not overwhelming and they were totally intelligible, and that was really great and lent a kind of place to it. And I thought in the middle of the play, I was like, it's lovely to have a play like this where you can just see all of these sort of characters from history having very human relationships. William Shakespeare was a very human person. He was just a person at the heart, and so I love seeing that, his friends, his family, this kind of just very honest and down-to-earth representation of what it was like. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, when I was looking at and learning about Henry, he had 9 kids, and only 3 of them grew up, made it past childhood. And so that really informed me, especially in his speech when he's talking to John about like, when my first son died, and then 5 more died later, that these plays I just envisioned gave him solace, got him through hard times, and that's why he fought so hard that we have to do this, we got to find him, because these meant the world to me, and I want to share them and don't want to lose them.
Yeah, I love that. I think that there's a tendency when you see that kind of loss to just assume it didn't hit people in the same way, but it absolutely did. You know, like I said, we have letters and journal entries from not just actors and players, but from people at that time period, and every single loss was horrible and felt very deeply. And it's amazing to like see these people continuing to create and produce and live their lives day to day under the burden of just like the insane amount of loss that they experienced. So yeah, it is a very sad part of Elizabethan life. Did you want to say what you?
I guess like for me mainly it was just trying to find some humanness, trying to find a human heart in these fictional characters they play, because obviously I'm playing like fictional characters, the only like real character I think was Ed Knight, he's the only real one. So it was just me just trying to find, you know, the heart to them, making sure they're like as grounded as possible in a comedic but also like in a more human way for them.
Yeah, things are only funny if we like the person. You know? And I think you did a great job of that. I think I saw a hand.
I was just going to say the old adage, the show must go on.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that was a life in the Elizabethan. I mean, I wrote right here, it was just like a lot of death. You know, there were plagues, there were, you know, it was pretty constant in everyone's life. So, but yeah, the show must go on, and that's a big reason theater was so popular, right? It was one of the only reliefs of the time. There wasn't, you know, phones and movies and all of these things. Like, people could pay a penny and go see a show, and for just 2 hours be I love the phrase, relieved of the burden of consciousness. Just for 2 hours, just watch a play. And it was very popular and people loved it. And I think, you know, that's the other thing is some of the other Elizabethan entertainments were very violent and very aggressive and very bloody. And then in the theater we start to see this place, and in print, we start to see more and more, you know, Johnson makes fun of the romances, but we start to see that come into like cultural appreciation more and more through the Renaissance. That's why it's such an important part of human history, is because we start to see love and care and tenderness able to come through in the art that people are creating. And, you know, people wanted to see stories just as much where, you know, well, not just as much. They wanted to see people eat their own children in pies, but they also really liked Falstaff. That's true too. So I think that's very sweet, you know.
Well, the humor must have really been appreciated given the circumstances.
Yeah, they must have been like, let us laugh. And eat oranges. They did eat a lot of fruit in the theater. So that was very accurate also.
And hopefully you didn't throw it.
Sometimes they threw it. My favorite account of Elizabeth, because Elizabethan theater was rowdy and smelly. So my favorite account of Elizabethan show is, it had nothing to do with Shakespeare, it was actually a young boys troupe. But they, troupe of poor young boys. And the audience just got mad, they didn't want to see the play, so they got up with their swords and were like, stop doing this play! They were like, we want to see the one you did last night, and the actors just had to like, switch plays in the middle and start doing it.
Well, that's where everybody gets this line about don't like the story you've written.
Yeah.
Everyone starts in an hour.
Yeah. Or right now, we'll do it right now, guys. We'll start it now. No one kill me. Yeah, it was pretty brutal. Elizabethan theater. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just a couple of observations.
Sure.
So it was written in 2017?
I don't know. Sounds good.
I think it's a little older than that.
Maybe not.
What was the
You know when
question?
the play was-
When the play was written. 2017.
17, I think.
Was it?
Yeah.
Oh, so it was a great job, and you guys all did such a fabulous job, and I was personally touched by the first scene of the second act, that's fiction. I don't watch, you know, they're like, I'm totally a nonfiction person. Like, my life has to be reality all the time.
Ugh.
I know. My son and I were like talking, like, gosh, so much. So that was just personally, that was this beautiful scene where they were talking about this touching, you know, we must go on, like you were just talking about, and it was just beautiful, the desperateness of keeping this unreal thing going because it's real, really.
What it makes you feel is real.
Yeah, sure. So it was really beautiful.
Kind of talking about like the play itself and how it itself was written. Just kind of learning a lot more about the Shakespeare's plays themselves and how he wrote plays. The writer, she really just kind of interpreted it into this play where there's humor and there's tragedy in it, and how there's a clown and everything. The clown might not be an actual clown that we imagine, but you know, it's portrayed as like the boy Hamlet or Marcus, who is just being a goofy kind of character around here. And it's just really interesting to see the parallel of how she wrote hers compared to how Shakespeare wrote his plays.
Yeah, she took some inspiration from
Exactly.
the comedy and the tragedy. And that's the thing, a lot of his plays, I mean, Much Ado About Nothing is one of his funniest plays, and also it has some deep tragedy and some really hard moments. So that was another way that Shakespeare kind of like went off on a limb from his contemporaries. He wrote things that were a little more diverse in content.
I noticed too I didn't notice it the first, second, fifth, 10th, but like by the time I had read it 20 and 25 times, I noticed how Gunderson sprinkled in, like, we have a pickle in publishing, and some of Shakespeare's lesser-known quotes all throughout the story. I thought it's so smartly written.
Yeah, it's really brilliant. And it's hard to write a play. So, appreciate it. All right, well, if no one has any other burning questions, I think we'll call it a day and give the actors another round of applause.
Thank you, Dawn.
Yes. I really want to thank Dawn Tucker from the Flagstaff Shakespeare Festival for joining us today. Thank you to Bruce Fox, the head of our board, and Stan Sutherland, the director. Thank you all very much.